Okay, so hello everyone, and thank you for being here. My name is Paul D'Ambrosio, and I teach Chinese philosophy at East China Normal University in Shanghai, where the四海为学collaborative learning project is based. Today, we're happy to host our second roundtable on social and political hierarchies. We have a stellar lineup of some of the most influential scholars in the field. Our speakers include Daniel Bell, Wang Pei, and Bai Tongdong. And our discussants include Rana, Jin Li, and Chang. And our chair is Duan Demin, who's of course welcome to join in all of the discussions as well. Before introducing the四海为学collaborative learning academic forum, I want to sincerely thank everyone speaking today, as well as everyone in the audience. And although we don't always mention this, a major motivation behind organizing this platform was the widespread social and political unrest and the deteriorating relationship between China and the West in particular. So the topic of today's roundtable, along with the caliber and the breadth of the scholars gathered here today, represent the founding spirit of 四海为学. So once again, thank you everyone for being here. Our structure for today is as follows. For the first 45 minutes or so, the speakers and discussants will discuss Bai and Wang's just hierarchies. For the second 45 minutes or so, this discussion will be focused on Bai's against political equality. And following this, the speakers and discussants will have a more open discussion about both books or about related topics for about 20 minutes. And then we'll open the floor for questions and comments from everyone in the audience. Our session will end promptly at 10:30 Beijing time, which is about 2.5 hours from now. But before getting started and handing things over to Professor Duan Demin, I just want to say a few words about this academic forum. The 四海为学collaborative learning project hopes to distinguish itself from some of the more unhelpful conventional practices in contemporary academia. As posted on our website, we are not interested in male peacocks, in jerks, or in any form of egoism and self-promotion. We hope to curb all forms of aggressive or look at me, I'm smarter than you, or don't I know so much, and similar attitudes found sometimes in academic exchanges. The 四海为学 project hopes to accomplish this shift in orientation during academic exchange by encouraging productive communication, humble discussions, real questions, and responses that are open and cooperative learning together. As many of us know all too well, miscommunication or missed communication can have disastrous results, from ordering the wrong food to starting wars. So let's not be jerks and try to learn together. And so before we get started, before I hand things over to Professor Duan Deming, I just want to briefly introduce him. Professor Duan Deming is Professor of Political Theory at the Department of Political Science in the School of Government at Peking University. He obtained his doctoral degree from the Institute of Philosophy at the University of Leuven in Belgium. Currently, he teaches and conducts research on political theories, history of political thought, and comparative political philosophy. Apart from studying various issues in Western political thought, he also publishes on Chinese traditional political thought, especially comparisons with the Western tradition and how it is still relevant today. His recent publications include Communitarian Interpretations of Confucianism and Just Hierarchies, The Machiavellian Movement in Modern Democracy, and the compatibility or incompatibility between Confucianism and modern democracy. He also has a book contract with the University of Wales Press on a project named Tocqueville Between East and West. So thanks again for everyone who's here, and I'll hand things over now to Professor Duan Demin.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction, and I'm very honored to be here as the moderator and I find this platform very interesting and very productive. And thank you again for bringing together these wonderful people from around the world to discuss very important and interesting topics. And today we have, as we mentioned, two wonderful books written by Professor Daniel Baer and Professor Wang Pei, and also by Professor Bai Tongdong. And I think these are wonderful selections. These two books have similar topics. The titles of the two books almost read like they're written by one person. I mean, Just Hierarchy basically is against the political equality. But of course, there are a lot of differences between these two books, which I hope we'll find out more in our following presentations and discussions. Okay, I'm going to briefly introduce our speakers and the commentators today, and afterwards I'll open the floor. So firstly, the author of Just Hierarchy, Professor Daniel Baer, is chair professor of political theory with the Faculty of Law at the University of Hong Kong. He served as Dean of School of Political Science and Public Administration at Shandong University from 2017 to 2022. His books include The Dean of Shandong Just Hierarchy, The China Model, Spirit of Cities, and many others. He's also author of Communitarianism and Its Critics. He's founding editor of Princeton China series, which translates and publishes original influential academic works from China. And his books has been translated in many languages. And Professor Wang Pei is also author of the book Just Hierarchy. She is assistant professor at the School of Chinese, the University of Hong Kong. She completed her PhD thesis on phenomenology at the Department of Philosophy of Tsinghua University, and was a joint PhD student in University Paris 1. She was a postdoc fellow at Tsinghua Institute of Advanced Studies in Humanities and Social Science. She's co-author with Daniel of Just Hierarchy. She has authored many other academic articles in English, Chinese, and French, mainly on phenomenology, ethics, comparative philosophy. She's currently writing a book titled The Power of Calligraphy, A Political History of Calligraphy in China. The author of the book Against Political Equality, Professor Bai Tongdong, he is professor he's Dongfang Chair Professor of Philosophy at Fudan University in China, and a member of the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences. His research interests include Chinese philosophy and political philosophy. He has two books published in English. One is China, the Political Philosophy of the Middle Kingdom, and the other one is the book we are discussing today, Against Political Equality, the Confucian Case, with Princeton University Press. He's also the director of an English-based MA and visiting program in Chinese philosophy at Fudan University that is intended to promote the studies of Chinese philosophy in the world. Our commentators today include Professor Rana. Professor Rana is ST Lee Chair in U.S.-Asia Relations at the Harvard Kennedy School. His most recent book is China's Good War. He works on contemporary Chinese history, particularly the Republican period. Our second commentator, Professor Jing Li, is Professor of Education and Human Development at Brown University. She received her BA in German from Guangzhou Institute of Foreign Languages. her first EDM in education from the University of Pittsburgh, and second EDM in administrative planning and social policy, and her EDD in human development and psychology from Harvard University. She studies Confucian and Western learning models and children's learning beliefs. She is author of Cultural Foundations of Learning, East and West, her new book entitled To Be or To Become, Philosophical Origins and Psychological Expressions of Self in the West and East Asia, will be published in 2024. In this treatise, Dr. Li synthesizes philosophy with psychological research to examine how the self is conceptualized and functions in these two cultural systems. And our third commentator, Chang, is a non-fiction writer and journalist covering Chinese politics and society. He was the China technology and correspondent for the New York Times, and his essays and criticisms have appeared in the New Yorker, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, Foreign Affairs, the LA Review of Books, and others. He's writing a book on post-pandemic China. Okay, these are the speakers and the commentators. So now we open the floor to the speakers. First, Professor Daniel Baer and Professor Wang Pei, you have 20 minutes to present your book. So please.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks to Paul to organize this fantastic roundtable, and we thanks to our commentators and also Professor Duan. Okay, I will share our slides here. Okay, so when I know when we're talking about hierarchy, it's something we should like cast away like many years ago, like especially in China. It's a country after radical revolution, and when we talk about a hierarchy, it's something as has been. I was one of them thinking that we should never talk about hierarchy. And when we were writing this book, we referred to some research of this sociologist and also like other scientists. It comes to be all complex and large-scale societies are organized along certain hierarchies. So it's inevitable. We need to talk about it, although it's kind of it's already kind of taboo in the modern world. So this title, Just Hierarchy, is we wanted to talk about something like we do not want to talk about unjust hierarchies, because unjust hierarchies has already been well elaborated, discussed already, but we wanted to talk about something like just a hierarchy. Actually, should be just hierarchies, and also it's kind of pun that it's just hierarchies is not something very dangerous. It's that's the title of our English version, and for the subtitle is Why Social Hierarchies Matter in China and the Rest of the World. And as Professor Duan mentioned, that Professor Bai's book Against the Political Equality, the title sounds quite similar to our book, so probably we should use each other's title to be our subtitles. It's just a joke. Anyway, okay, in this book we discussed the 5 different social hierarchies, starting with family, just hierarchy in the family, and just hierarchy between citizens, like rulers and the common people, then just hierarchy among countries, between states, international level, and then just hierarchy between humans and animals, then humans and machines. So this book is quite, we would say it's quite Confucian influenced, because we discussed something as the very beginning of our ethical practice, basically family. So, and we extend it to from family to strangers, from citizen to foreigner, from human to animal, and also from human to AI to robots, basically. But the point is, when we translate this book into Chinese version, we can see that the title is a 正序论. It's not easy to come up with this title because it's so difficult to translate a hierarchy in a Confucian way. How can we discuss something like, although hierarchy can be quite Confucian, because like Xunzi discussed already, like 群 is hierarchical, but still 等级 it's a very pejorative word, even in Confucianism. So we try to use Chinese translations like 等级 秩序 or 层制 差等 层次, lots of words. No one works. And in the end, Professor Chen Jianhong in Zhongshan University, he suggests us to use this word 正序论. That sounds, to me, sounds quite, at least not so negative in Confucianism, because Zheng is one of the most important character in Confucianism, like Zheng Ming. So this Zheng is very nice. That's why we use this as our Chinese title. Okay, and another thing I need to emphasize in the very beginning is that we didn't write this book for people who benefits from unjust hierarchies. So for the Chinese version, we have one line here. We dedicate this book to people who suffer from unjust hierarchies. We didn't write this book for like aristocrats or slave owners, or like in Chinese 大家长, this big father figure in huge family. We didn't write this book for them. We write this book for people who suffered from unjust hierarchies. We wanted to explore some kind of possibility to discuss just the hierarchies that can be morally justified. Okay, so okay, you can talk.
Well, you want to say the family or no?
No, you talk.
Okay.
Professor Bell would.
So please don't call me Professor Bell. Just call me Daniel. Thank you, Professor Wang.
Okay.
Again, and to use our approach, we call it a progressive conservative approach, which we argue is a kind of Confucian-inspired idea. Of course, as we know, the Confucian tradition is very rich and diverse, but certainly the early Confucians like Kongzi and Mengzi and Xunzi, they were radical social critics in their own day, who moved from state to state, of course, before China was unified under Qin Shi Huangdi, and hoping to persuade rulers to adopt a more, let's say, moral form of rule. And generally speaking, they were not very successful, and they turned to scholarship and teaching as a kind of second choice. But so they were also very traditional, right? Especially like Kongzi, Confucius is very explicit, appealing to this golden age as a kind of ideal to criticize the present. So they were both very progressive or radical social critics, but also conservative. And of course, sometimes the conservatism is I don't want to use the word insincere, but they weren't very forthcoming about their innovations. Just one obvious example, what it means to be a junzi. Before Kongzi, if you were a junzi, meant somebody who's a kind of aristocrat, meaning you're there because of your blood family lines. And he changed the meaning of junzi to say, no, only people who are morally exemplary are junzi. So actually, we like Roger Ames's translation of junzi as exemplary person. So basically, the Confucians are not always very explicit, but to the extent that hierarchies are justified, they need to benefit those at the bottom of hierarchies. And so when we look at 5 social relations, 3 of them involve people. And the common pattern among them is that they benefit not just those with power, but those with less power on the bottom of social hierarchies. But within this overall scheme, we argue that there are different principles that inform the particularities of different social hierarchies. So we need to look at, it's quite a contextual work, and we need to look at the social context in great detail before we could think of how hierarchies might be justified. But the general pattern, at least the Confucian-inspired pattern, is that they are justified if they could benefit those on the bottom of hierarchies. So as Professor Wang mentioned, the first hierarchy we look at, of course, it's as a kind of Confucian framework, we learn about morality through the family. That's where we develop our caring relations. And the Confucians spent most time on defending the value of filial piety, xiao, right? Which we can translate sometimes as reverence for elderly members of the family and ancestors. I think that might be a more accurate translation. And what justifies these age-based hierarchies? So we write it, we in the English version, certainly, we go into great detail about what might justify that. But
okay, we basically, as I mentioned, family is the beginning, the first area for everyone, especially people in East Asia, to practice to do this ethical practices. So family is very important, and also for Confucianism, family is very important too. So we have two versions of this first chapter. The English version, we wrote it for like foreigners. I'm Chinese, for foreigners, like they do not quite familiar with this culture of family reverence or something. When we did a talk in Norway, there are like one lady came to me saying that her grandson and granddaughter can call her by her first name. I told her this is completely impossible in China, but she felt like, why not? She felt it's quite like a hygge in Danish or in Norwegian language, like some warm feelings. But for Chinese, that's something we do not understand. That's why we give like six or seven arguments on why filial piety matters. But in Chinese version, basically we rewrite it. We focused on how filial piety can easily go wrong, especially in this Confucian influenced social context. And we saw this news, social news every day, like this conflict between two generations, conflicts between three generations in China. Okay, so in this Chinese version, we discussed more on this from this perspective. And just quickly mention the last two chapters, because we're not going to elaborate that a lot in this short presentation. This just hierarchy between humans and animals. We discuss relations like people and their pets, or people and the animals that they eat. But like people, like when like the relation with my cat and me, just like a simple argument that I won't send my cat to somewhere like cat's coffee, kitten's coffee, to do labor work, 打工, to earn money for me to buy books or whatever. But I would do this labor. I would be taxing to buy canned food for him and her. We have two cats. Okay, so, and the last chapter on just hierarchies between humans and the machines. When we talk about machines, we're not talking about refrigerator or this washing machine. No, we're talking about AI, artificial intelligent robots, the relation between humans and them. Now we do not think it's a very good, it's not a very good this ambience, atmosphere, or in like phenomena that this AI like ChatGPT, they're doing so many things that's quite desirable, like writing poems, do paintings. But in this chapter, we argue that we want machines to do undesirable works for us, but not such desirable works. So let's see last two chapters. And okay. Here.
So I very quickly go through I won't just summarize our conclusions. For the second chapter, we argue that hierarchies between rulers and common people can be justified if the rulers serve the people and if they have the trust of the people. And we appeal to some sort of Confucian ideas to make that point. But of course, we argue that there's a large gap between the ideal and the reality, and we show that gap in great detail, which, by the way, helps to explain why in the Chinese version of the book, we had to cut about half of the chapter. It's the most, well, censored chapter of the book, just because we use mainly the examples that are from contemporary China. So we're committed to the ideal of political meritocracy, which means that the political system should aim, in Chinese, 贤能政治, that the political system should aim to select and promote public officials with above average ability and virtue virtue means serving the people. But we argue that there's a gap between, a rather large gap between the ideal and the reality. The third chapter is about hierarchies between countries, and we argue here that the hierarchy can be justified if they are win-win, if they benefit. And here it's a different dynamic than the relation between rulers and common people in one country, where the hierarchy is justified if the rulers serve the people. But in international relations, the hierarchies need to serve both countries with more power and countries with less power. And we appeal to Xunzi's idea. I personally, I think Xunzi is the greatest political theorist in the Chinese tradition. I know my downstairs neighbor, Professor Justin Tiwald, might agree with that view. And unfortunately, his student, Han Fei, very much vulgarized his view. Sorry, Tongdong, if you're listening. And because of that, mainly, Xunzi's reputation was blackened, but it's coming back today among both academics and others in mainland China. By the way, I taught a course on Xunzi at Shandong University, and I brought my students to Lanling, where there's a Xunzi mu, his kind of grave, like his graveyard, I guess. That's not the right word. Anyway, there's and there the local officials in Lanling are very, very proud, and there's a museum about Xunzi. Okay, so again, this sort of thing about hierarchies between large countries and small countries. Of course, large countries, because they're large, have an extra share of responsibility for dealing with issues. So they can't shirk a shared responsibility. In fact, they need to assume an extra share of responsibility on issues like climate change. But I'm going to end here so that we leave more time for others. I think it's been about 20 minutes. Thank you. Do you want to say something? No. Okay. Thank you for the opportunity to present our views.
Okay, thank you very much.
This is our cat.
Yeah. Okay, sure. Go ahead. Okay.
You can take it.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Daniel Bai and Professor Wang Pei, for this wonderful presentation and perfect collaboration. But I have to say, Daniel, I noticed you asked Professor Wang Pei not to call you Professor Bai, but you later called her Professor Wang. I think this is unfair, and I don't know. Maybe there's a reason of hierarchy there. I'm not sure. But anyways, thank you for this wonderful presentation. And now we move on to our commentators. The first commentator is Professor Rana. Professor Rana, you, according to suggestion from Paul, maybe you can use about 5 minutes to say the comment, and Daniel and Wang Pei can respond to. Okay, so please.
Thanks very much indeed, Demin. And I think we'll keep all hierarchies out of this conversation, and I'm sure we'll all stick to first names. So great to hear from Daniel and Pei. I mean, this is a very, very interesting book. I had a great privilege of being able to read and review it for the Financial Times a couple of years ago. There's much in it that I find very stimulating and I absolutely agree with. There's some elements that I take a different view, which in my view makes it one of the best sorts of books because it provides both lots of great substance and some areas on which we can have an interesting discussion as well, which I hope we will today. I think that actually one of the most valuable contributions that this book makes is, as our two authors have pointed out, to make respectable, if that's the right way, the idea that hierarchies and divisions in society have their useful divisions in that sense. I'm reminded in some ways, although not in every way, of course, of some of the aspects of Mao's adaptation of Marxist theory, where he developed ideas of contradictions, which can be either antagonistic or non-antagonistic. And both of those have their values in terms of social change. What I think actually makes the proposition of the authors about hierarchy different is that, to caricature wildly, and we have some experts here on Confucianism, which I am not, so I look forward to being contradicted, but to caricature very wildly, one might say that the idea of hierarchy, certainly put in a Confucian context, might be not an argument about social change, but about social lack of change. In other words, although you've explained very articulately in the book and also in the presentation why it is that hierarchy can be justified, the question then comes up, and I'm genuinely interested in the answer: how is it then that social change happens? You talk about progressive conservatism, and I'm reminded, of course, Daniel, that you're a Canadian, and for a long time there used to be a political party, I think you mentioned this in your book, with the non-antagonistic contradiction in its name of being the Progressive Conservative Party of Canada. If I remember correctly, though, in some antagonism, that party finally broke up about 30 years ago and split into various parts. So progressive conservatism, even in the West, has its own difficulties. Leaving that aside, let's stick to the wider idea. And I think, because I've read your other books as well, Daniel, that what you're trying to do, correct me if I'm wrong when you come back for comment, is to, in a sense, get away from the question of China specifically, and instead look at this as a model, a way of thinking about politics, which could be anywhere in some senses. Now, if that's the case, and I'm very happy to work with the idea of a sort of generalizability, a more abstract application of these processes, or these frameworks, then let me ask a couple of things. These would be my provocations to you, which I'd be delighted to hear your and Pei's answers to. Number one is that question of social change. What does progressive social change look like in this model? I mean, if we turn to Confucianism for a moment, although I think historians would attest that actually the simple idea that Confucianism is in no way tolerant of, say, women's education is not actually shown if you look at the history of elite women in the Song, Ming, Qing, and elsewhere. And yet, if we are honest, we will point out that traditional, and I hate that word, but I'll use it for a moment, or long-standing Confucian social norms have not always, or usually are not, let's be more frank, usually are not very progressive towards breaking down gendered hierarchies. Now, I know that you've made the point that you're not looking to support unjust hierarchies, but the point, of course, is that the idea that gender differences is unjust is very much a 20th and 21st century construct in China and in many other places too. In the idea that, say, on voting, the division between men and women was an entirely just hierarchy in a way that in the 2020s, I think none of us would support. China, of course, solves this problem, as we know, by not letting anyone vote, which is a different sort of equal hierarchy or lack of hierarchy in another sense, but again, not necessarily one that all of us would support. For avoidance of doubt, I do not support that idea. Beyond that, I want to also ask if one of my P words is progress, the other P word is power. I said in my review, and I'll say again, I still want to hear more about how power relations are mediated. You have described an ideal type, which is perfectly reasonable for a political philosopher and political theorist. I'm reminded of that great French phrase, "Je veux vivre en théorie, parce que en théorie, tout va bien." As a Canadian, I'm sure you'll recognize that. But I want to live in theory, because in theory, everything always goes fine. The problem is that most of us, even at Harvard University, do not spend our time living entirely in theory, much though I think some of my colleagues would like to do. We live in the real world. Confucius, of course, lived in a very real, very violent world in his own time. And understanding how a just hierarchy actually mediates power in practice. It doesn't have to be China. I mean, this is, I know, that the often misleading thing that people bring back to saying, well, the Chinese system doesn't work that way, so this doesn't work. But I'd be intrigued to see where else you see any practical application. Otherwise, perhaps we find ourselves in the world of the Fouriers and the Saint-Simons and others who put forward extraordinarily utopian ideas in the 18th, 19th century in Europe, or indeed Kang Youwei, a great Chinese thinker, much influenced by the West as well as by Confucian tradition in the late 19th century. Kang Youwei was a Confucian beyond compare. He thought up lots of ideas for how life could be made better, maybe marriage being an annual contract. That's certainly a good way of reducing hierarchy. He set up a sort of colony, if I remember correctly, in Mexico, which didn't go so well. He even got into hot air ballooning, I think, at one point. Perhaps the hierarchy he wanted to avoid was up in the skies. But even Kang Youwei, one of the most interesting, if in some ways eccentric thinkers on these questions, didn't really, I think, manage to find a solution. So that's a tough challenge to ask you to go one better than one of the most important Confucian thinkers of the last 150 years. But I'm sure Daniel and Pei, the two of you particularly put together, are up to the challenge. And thank you for the chance to comment on this fascinating book. Demin, back to you.
Sure. Thank you very much for the comment. Daniel and Wang Pei, would you like to respond briefly, please?
Okay, well, you want to go first?
Okay. For the first question, actually, we have a session on the in the chapter 2, on this the second part. Is it possible to? Oh yeah. Is that? Section 3. Political meritocracy as a problem or political meritocracy as a solution. So in this part, basically we discussed this different kind of system. We call it political meritocracy in ancient China, to select and elect and select and promote those talents into the imperial court. So in the beginning, from Qing dynasty to Han dynasty, they have this recommendation. In Qing dynasty is they would promote people who cuts most of the heads of the enemies. They promote that. Professor Europeans wrote a book on that. And in Han dynasty, we have this recommendation system, so that people who have certain, like in 4 different abilities, who have certain abilities can be selected. And also after that, in Sui Tang, we have this also like 九品中正制. After that, we have this imperial examination system, and they use this just examination. Now we still use it, like 公务员考试, this exam system for government officials in China. And I think also in the UK as well. I won't call it it's 公务员考试, but it's an examination system. And in Song and the Ming Song dynasty, Chang brothers and Zhu Xi also criticized that this imperial system is not very effective. So every single time in the history of Confucianism, in this this discussion, inner discussions, they would say that the court is not energetic anymore. Is not vibrant anymore. So we need a new system to select the people. But they won't say, we will let them vote. Let 老百姓 common people to vote for who can be the leader of one big city or something, who can be in charge of the finance. at that time. They won't do that. They do recommendation. When it doesn't work, they have imperial examination system. And when imperial examination system doesn't work, Zhu Xi and Er Chen suggest we can revive a little bit of this recommendation system as well. So they would, in Confucianism, they wanted to solve problems in this whole, I would say, in this whole coherent theory. They do not want to create a new way, like voting, or actually I think sortition is not that bad. Professor Wang Shaoguang wrote a book on that as well, but in Chinese history we didn't have that. They have social change, but yeah.
So basically, in our book we do describe the ideal, but we also try to show how it might be institutionalized in a way as to maximize its advantages and reduce its disadvantages. And regarding the ideal of political meritocracy in a country, we show that it's precisely when political meritocracies became ossified that there was a need for new thinking about institutions and practices that would allow for more social change and social mobility, more promotion of the able and virtuous, and demotion of those who are less able and virtuous. And there's this constant sometimes improvement, but sometimes backwards stepping in that respect. But it's precisely when the institutions became ossified that there was innovations. And we argue that we may have reached the point where this sort of thing might be the situation in contemporary China, when corruption became way out of hand. And of course, corruption by definition means that officials are not serving the people, they're serving themselves or their family. So we have a long discussion about how to reduce corruption, precisely so that as to allow for more, for political meritocracy to work in a better way and to have more social change. But we argue that the anti-corruption campaign has had many bad consequences. So we're a bit, so actually that part has been pretty much all censored from the Chinese version.
Okay.
And about men and women, you want to say something about that? Or?
Yeah, and also about power, I wanted to answer a little bit, because for this book, we can see that we have 5 chapters, and we begin with family. We do not think family is like a playground for power. At least being a Chinese, I don't feel that. Family sometimes it combines with, of course, there is the power, but also love. So sometimes it's more about love, and power can take a form of love in that way. Anyway, okay. And what I wanted to make the point is like this gender hierarchy. Okay, I know in this political level, it's not in a very ideal situation, but in family level or in social level, if a person who is not very filial pious to his or her mother, especially his mother, his reputation is going to be doomed. And if he still wants to hold the power in the imperial court, that is not a very good news for him, because his colleagues would just write some articles or something against him, saying that you are not a virtuous person, you do not deserve this job. So like this, I won't say it's gender equality or whatever, but filial piety took some kind of discussion on this gender thing. And even nowadays, for if you, especially in Shandong, I've heard it's in Shandong, especially Qufu, the hometown of Confucius, that if a local government official wants to get promoted, those people who do background check for him or her would go to visit his parent or her parents, asking that, how about your kids? Is he or her filial pious? If the answer is no, it's highly possible that him or her he or she couldn't get promoted. So still, I would say, and I agree that hierarchy is basically a power question. So we would argue that in the last chapter, the hierarchy between humans and machines is more related to power, is more power like oriented. Chapter 4 a little bit, chapter 3 even less, and chapter 1 is basically we want to use power to discuss this this age-based hierarchy in the family. Okay, your turn.
So basically, though, I mean, we do say that, we just accept that the modern view that men and women are equals. And it's true that Confucians prior to the 20th century didn't make that point, but neither did almost every other tradition, maybe except for Taoism, right?
Only in Taoism.
Yeah. But that said, I mean, Confucianism, like compared to like Aristotle, who argued that women are the biological inferiors of men, there was never that sort of view that, for example, women couldn't be Junzi. I mean, it wasn't explicitly ruled out. So arguably, it's easier to reform Confucianism so that it's more compatible with modern ideas of gender equality. That said, I mean, we do need to recognize that there's a big difference between what we can call like high Confucianism and vulgar Confucianism. And high Confucianism is like the philosophically justified Confucianism. Vulgar Confucianism is the way that it's been interpreted at local levels. And it's still these kind of vulgar views that, wives should listen to husbands still play a very important sociological role. That's one reason why arguably Shandong province is the most patriarchal part of China. I regret to say, because I very much love Shandong province. But it's because of this, the social influence of, what we can call vulgar Confucianism, which needs to be challenged, obviously, by what we can call high Confucianism.
Okay. I have to as much as I want this one for discussion to continue, I have to stop you guys here, and we have very strict time limit because Professor Rana will have to leave around 9:30, and we have a lot of comments and also a presentation by Professor Bai Tongdong, so we have to move on. Sorry about that. And for the follower commentators, please stick to the time limit. About 5 minutes comment. Okay, and we can have more discussion after all the speakers and commentators have said their piece. Okay, so Professor Jing Li, the floor is yours, so please. You are muted, Professor Jing Li. You are.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can you hear me? Okay. So first, thank you very much for this opportunity to participate in this forum. This is extremely interesting, although it's not strictly my sort of intellectual discipline, but that's okay because I read Professor Bell and Wang's book, and I feel that this book has been due over for a long time in the world. So the 5 chapters each address very important domains of the human world. As you note, there has been a tendency in the West, of course, during Mao, communism, of course, that also, but also increasingly across the globe to mute all hierarchies. It is clear that in reality, hierarchies continue to exist. Okay. You commented on calling each other by the first name and so on. Okay. And Professor Wang mentioned your trip to Norway, and that's extremely interesting here. I have one example. At many US graduate schools, students are told by their mentors, just call me by John, my first name. Okay. This was a total shock to me at Harvard because no one really believes that the students and the big professors are really equal. However, the espoused ideology or philosophy is that we ought not to think about hierarchies. At least we ought to strive to ignore or try to do away with them. I have a few comments and questions for both of you. For now, maybe just focus on the 2 chapters because of time constraints. Okay. My first question is more general. Why do you think that there is this mismatch or schizophrenia, if I may, between the deeply entrenched hierarchies and the promotion of the ideology or philosophical effort to pretend that hierarchies are not there or ought not to exist? That's just my first general question. Move on. Regarding chapter 1, between just hierarchy between intimates. You discussed the 6 values of age-related hierarchy within the family. Those are great, okay? My question is, what do you think a lack of such family hierarchy would miss? For example, a better parent-child relationship in the West, which is my discipline, is said to be based on equality, as you saw in that Norwegian example. So parents would like to become friends with their children, even very young children, like, toddlers. What difficulties do you see such a model might generate? Move on to chapter 2, just hierarchy between citizens. You discussed the hierarchy between the ruler and the ruled, and you surveyed the development of political meritocracy in China. During Confucius' time, the idea of filial piety, again, I'm glad that came up, as a measure of moral achievement, at least as a foundational moral achievement among rulers, okay? Not just the commoners, but the rulers, right? And their court officials was already very strong, although the Warren states and the Spring-Autumn Orange states valued competence and often questionable, or morally questionable means more than virtue. For example, the legalist tenet. But virtue's importance was never absent, as clearly detailed in Sima Guang's comprehensive mirror of aid of governance, 资治通鉴. But even during the 400 years of the Spring Autumn and the Orange State, there was this state called Teng Wengong, featured in mansions, who did try to follow Confucian benevolent governance. Okay, during Han and later dynasties, being moral and virtuous was an aspired standard for selecting officials, as Professor Wang mentioned. I agree that even today, Confucian meritocracy is still influential. My question is, why do you think that filial piety assumes such importance in Chinese political meritocracy? Despite challenges, I heard that part of Xi Jinping's appeal is that he is a big filial son, 大孝子. This is as if being filial would make people forgive or tolerate leaders despite their blemishes. Likewise, one way the Chinese people condemn or show serious consequences of corrupt officials is to demonstrate their public remorse that their greed and misconduct has hurt their parents deeply. So finally, I'm asking this question in light of Joseph Chan's idea that you featured in your book, the Chinese people's willingness to accept the ruler/leader. It seems that filial piety is always an important factor in whether people would have this willingness. That's my comment.
Okay, thank you very much for Professor Xin Li's comment. And Daniel and Wang Pei, you have like 4 minutes to respond. Please stick to the time limit, because I do really want to include Professor Rana comment on Professor Bai Tongdong's book. Okay, 4 minutes.
Okay, thank you, Professor Li Jing. Thank you for your questions. I will answer the first 2. The first is on why there is a schizophrenia that people are promoting equality, but still we're living in this hierarchical society, if I understand in the correct way. Yes, I wrote an article on that. Basically, I think we really need to be very cautious on that, because this sometimes, like for gender equality, sometimes we would tell us that yes, men and women are equal, we're equal, husband and wife are equal. Actually, they're not. They're never equal. We should never just in Chinese we will say like brainwash. Like women brainwash themselves that we're like the men, and the husband and wife are the same. We're doing same amount of housework. It's never true. It's never true. Never, as I said in that articles, we should be very lucid that do not drown ourselves in this fake equality. We really need to be very cautious on this. This is the first thing. The second, on the on the family issue, on the filial piety, yes, I wrote another article on that as well. I should use the schizophrenia. I really like this word. I said it's this modern problem for traditional families. Because in Chinese, we can see each family are quite traditional. Fathers are just father, mothers are mother. As I said, gender equality never exists, and children are like children. But parents wanted to convince themselves and to persuade kids, saying that we are friends. Okay, like mother and daughters can be sisters, father and sons can be brothers. That's so wrong. Kids can be a little bit like a little bit with lower level of self-defense under that circumstances. When they come across some very important decision in their life, they realize that, oh, father is always father. He just refused me to do this, and he's never my brother. He lied to me. And daughter would think, why my mother want me to break up with my boyfriend? Why would she can't have a say on this? It's this so-called generation equality is never true. So here is the schizophrenia in Chinese family. It's so like typical because we are more traditional than I would say in the general Western families. Probably they're less traditional, but in China we're so traditional. But we want to be like very modern, a la mode, fashionable. This new equality. Even my parents will use the word American style. This equality. Equal style. Actually, it's never true. So we can see in China we have lots of these conflicts among different generations, and it causes lots of problems, physically, psychologically, a lot. So thank you for asking these questions. And in the Chinese version of Just Hierarchy, we discussed a little on this issue. Yeah.
So and very quickly, I don't know how much, just politically, I mean, just think of efforts to pretend that there's no equality, you know, the French Revolution or the Cultural Revolution. I mean, that leads to disasters, right? Where the hierarchies come rearing back in very ugly forms. So basically, it's important to recognize that there are hierarchies and then think about how to distinguish between the good ones and the bad ones. That's so important, but it's not really done. One tiny, we don't have time, but let me just.
Daniel, you have to stop there. Sorry about that. Maybe you can say more about this after all we have said our pieces. Sorry about that. Okay, Mr. Chang, you have 5 minutes. Please go.
Hi, everyone. Thank you to all the organizers for having me. I feel underqualified in this panel of great experts. I think I share the views of many of the commentators when I say that the work that Daniel Pei and Professor Bai have produced has been long overdue in the Western literature and Western political theory departments. I feel that so much of the world has changed, and there's a sense in which models of politics in both the East and West have kind of may have run out of steam, and the search for alternatives is really important. And I really I find your work, everyone's work here that is presenting today to be extremely significant. I want to say that I'm not going to be commenting on any of the normative dimensions of the work, partly because I don't feel qualified to discuss it. But what I do feel qualified to maybe talk about is how I see some of the arguments made in the ideal world, the theoretical world, and how it, I think, maps on to real world circumstances in both the United States and China. The first, I think the most valuable, I think one of the most valuable reasons why one of the reasons why I started to read Just Hierarchies was because I felt there was a sense that Western and especially Western societies are plagued by hierarchies. And a lot of the theories, a lot of the theorists in the Western tradition seem to kind of ignore them. And so one of the most valuable elements of just hierarchies, I believe, is just not just to suggest the core argument that hierarchies can be desirable, but also just to elucidate the fact that societies are, in fact, the default of societies is organized as such. And if we look from the perspective of hierarchies in Western societies, we realize, the corporation, of course, the family, mentorships, all academia, everything is structured by hierarchies. And somehow the discussion of politics in the West is primarily about equality. So I really value that part of the work. I think that when it comes to my central point with my commentary is to suggest that I find an area of hierarchy that isn't getting as much coverage in the book. And that is the area of economic hierarchies or so inequality is sort of structured on the basis of wealth or education. What I mean here is the relations between the 1% and the 99%, or Wall Street, Main Street. And if we look in China, we can say the coastal coastal cities like Beijing and Shanghai, and the inland provinces, or the 985, graduates versus those who work at Foxconn, and those kinds of relationships that are structured based on wealth and education. And the reason why I bring this up is because I think that in both China and the US, we already have a sense in which these hierarchies can be just. And the reason why they are just is in some ways based on merit. That some who rise economically to the top of the socioeconomic ladder deserve to be there because they showed their abilities on the SAT or the Gaokao. And so I guess my first question for you all is what would constitute just hierarchies in the economic space? Is it going to map onto our intuitions that we already have about you can make it if you try, sort of the idea of ability rising up to the top? And how does it mix with the socialist commitments? I think that China has. We talk about some of the Confucian-inspired elements of China, but China also has a very in contemporary China also has a very strong tradition of socialist commitments, especially in the economic realm. And I wanted to sort of point out here one other sort of danger that I think comes with the views of meritocracy, especially when it comes to the economic space, which is around this idea that there's a kind of dark side of meritocracy, which is that if you order people on the economic ladder based on ability, then those who fall to the bottom it is entirely of their fault. And this kind of status, this kind of idea that you are at the bottom because you deserve to be there, the idea of the unworthy. I worry, I think, about meritocracy because I fear that those who are relegated to the bottom have a kind of status stigma that is associated with it. And I feel that in China and the US, there is definitely a dynamic that works like this. In the US, I believe it has beget some kind of populist uprisings, and in China, I think we have a term that like 内卷 or involution that kind of gets a little bit at this topic of intense meritocracy, creating a kind of stigma at the bottom. So those are the sort of the two questions that I'd like to pose to the authors. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the comment. And Daniel and Wang Pei, you have like 3 to 4 minutes to respond quickly, please.
Well, thank you. I mean, it's a great point, and there's one, I think, really important difference, though, between China and, let's say, the US, which is that the idea of meritocracy in China, it's really limited to, it's a political idea, that it's public officials who ought to be selected and promoted according to this meritocratic process. And by meritocracy, a key feature is the ability and willingness to serve the community. So there's this other regarding outlook built in at the very in the structure of political meritocracy. And that goes back way, it's both a Confucian and a socialist idea. But the first obligation of government is to look after the worst off, you know, for like Mengzi would be guan gua gudu, like those without family members, to look after them. And the idea that the government has a strong obligation to alleviate poverty, that goes way back in Chinese history, much earlier than the West. So, and so there's a very sharp distinction in China between political meritocracy and economic meritocracy, the idea that you should be rewarded with lots of money if you work hard because you're talented, that's not so deeply held. And of course, both the Confucians and the socialists say that how do you distribute resources? Well, it should be more according, like Mencius, you know, Mencius says, you know, you should look at the way that land is distributed. Of course, that's a socialist idea too. I think the kind of Chinese idea of political meritocracy is compatible, not just in a theoretical way, but practically speaking, with a kind of more socialist ideas of distribution, where the goods are distributed, you know, to use Marxist language, more according to need rather than ability. But in practice, of course, it doesn't always. I mean, more often than not, does not work that way. But at least. So that's why I think Paul himself wrote on this. You know, when Michael Sandel writes about meritocracy, and he doesn't distinguish clearly between economic and political meritocracy, but in China, I think it's a very clear distinction. Yeah, that's why when we talk about meritocracy, I think we do need to use the adjective political meritocracy to make sense of the argument here. I don't know, do you want to say something quickly? Okay, so sorry, it's a very brief response, but it's okay.
Okay, yeah. Okay, I think, yeah, that's very good. Thank you for the response. And we have to move on to Professor Bai Tongdong's talk. Professor Bai or Master Bai, could you use for about 15 minutes to present? I know it's unfair, but I do want to get Rana's comment before he goes. And I'm the chair, so it's hierarchy. So please use just 15 minutes also to give the talk.
Actually, can I make a different suggestion? Can we ask Rana to comment first? I mean, I think people here probably know my work and Daniel and Pei's works well, and so this way we have enough time to. If that's okay with the chair.
Yeah, no, that's a great idea. Not least, I apologize that to the audience and everyone here. I have to travel in about 20 minutes, so I think that's a very good idea. I would just say 5 minutes in that case, and then please bring back Tongdong and continue the discussion. So thank you for that. So Tongdong's book has become very well known in the 2 or 3 years since it's been published. But I would say, if I had to summarize it, and I would love to hear Tongdong's response to know if he would agree with this or not, but in some ways, it is the best liberal argument I have heard against democracy in the classic sense of equalized political participation that I've read in a long time. One of the things that I think is misleading in some of the interpretations I've read of it is that some people seem to think that it is a justification of essentially a system that excludes any liberal ideas. And I think that the primary argument that it seems to me that Tongdong is making is a passionate defense of liberal ideas and arguing that on many occasions, the liberal democratic state is not necessarily the best way to preserve those sorts of values. And for those who want to follow that argument, I agree with some of it. I would have issues with other parts, but I think it's fair to say that the wider world, where there are multi-party electoral systems and equal political participation in those systems, has not been very successful at protecting many liberal values in the last 10 years or so. We can see that in many parts of Europe, in North America, in parts of Asia, the institution of formal political equality in terms of political participation has meant that institutions, whether they are universities, courts, the broadcast media, I'm going a little bit beyond what Tongdong says in the book, I think, but I take this argument from it. Many of these have come much under attack because it has not been possible to maintain the simultaneous existence of full political participation and the maintenance of the liberal sphere, in which the protection of minority views, the protection of unpopular views, is regarded as a social good in its own right. And I think that is for me, one of the most powerful parts of the argument. I guess the question that I would put in response to this very powerful articulation of the idea is the question of, nonetheless, it's a little bit like the question actually of Daniel and Pei about their model of just hierarchy. What happens when the political system, which is in this vision, does not encourage equality, does not encourage equal participation in that sense, then once again arrogates power to itself that is used for illiberal ends? It is possible that people may be Frederick the Great, perhaps one of the best examples in the Western world of the enlightened autocrat, but it's also possible that the autocratic ruler becomes Ivan the Terrible and uses the destruction of alternative methods to bring popular participation into government as a means of arrogating control. Now, clearly, one particular political framework cannot answer all these questions. I don't expect it to, any more than I do for Daniel and Pei's very interesting set of ideas. But I think that what I would ask you, Tongdong, is, first of all, do I have it right that, in a sense, you are arguing that one of the ways in which certain types of liberal institution or pluralist institution can be preserved in the wider public sphere in any society, it doesn't have to be China, is by downgrading the idea that full equal political participation is the only way to go? But on the other hand, is it fair to say that that kind of political structure then needs to find other ways to preserve that pluralism and liberalism? I mean, again, where I think in Hong Kong, where I think Pei and Daniel are sitting at the moment, maybe some others are as well, we have moved quite quickly from a political anomaly from the 1990s up to the 2010s of a city-state which had a highly liberal political sphere and very little political equality whatsoever, to one in the last few years where there's very little political equality, but also a an immense narrowing of the liberal institutions. So it is possible, unfortunately, to move from the first situation to the other. Some thoughts there, and again, as with Daniel and Pei's book, it's a wonderful piece of writing, and anyone who hasn't read it, I highly recommend that they should read Tongdong's very, very rigorous and very thoughtful piece of work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rana, for the comment. And now we move on to Master Bai's talk. You can talk about 20 minutes, I guess. Please.
No, so maybe I'll just first respond to Rana's comment. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So before he leaves, right. So I mean, thank you for the summary of my book. You know, I studied physics before when Schrödinger discovered the Schrödinger equations. His interpretations are now accepted, and they consider his interpretations terrible, and they said that Schrödinger's equations are smarter than Schrödinger. I think Professor Mitter's summary is better than my book. You know, I think it's really a very, very nice summary. The strong liberal defense. Yeah, I think that catches my view. Yes, I think that as long as we have this kind of full, equal participation through one person, one vote, the liberal institutions would be under threat. So we need to restrict democracy in order to save liberalism. I think so the first half, I think that is precisely my view. And then the worry, whether this kind of a meritocratic branch will take power to itself, gradually becoming illiberal branch. So I think in my proposal, I still try to preserve the participatory part. And I'm just trying to argue that maybe the one person, the institution of one person, one vote should not be the only and ultimate political decision institution. We should have other institutions that balance its power. And so maybe through this balance, because the meritocrats do not have the sole monopoly, whereas I think in Hong Kong, the people never had a full participation in a meaningful way. And also, I think in terms of even the terrible, in my book I try to argue that the branch of the meritocratic branch should consist of a large number of members, so that they couldn't form cliques, small partisan groups to carry out their ideas. And so there's some kind of balance of power within among the meritocrats. And also, of course, there needs to be strict rule of law and constitutionalism. So I was hoping that those things, right, meritocrats balancing each other, a popular branch, one person branch by one person, one vote, can balance the meritocrats. Eventually, rule of law, some kind of constitutional processes can prevent the meritocrats from taking too much power. And actually, my worry is not that the meritocrats will take power away. Rather, now we have this, really sacred idea of, popular sovereignty. I think maybe any kind of meritocratic elements will be eroded by the popular elements of any society. So I guess my worry that in spite of my design, theoretical design, the people still will take power away and then destroy liberalism. So I guess my worry is along that line, rather the other way around. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, Professor Bai, would you like to say
sure.
more about your book itself, the talk?
Right.
Yes.
Right. So actually, I think Professor Mater already did a wonderful job. So my initial hunch is that I think both in theory and in practice, we often talk about liberal democracy as if it is one thing, but in theory, the liberal part and democratic part are two different concepts, and in practice, we see that the democratic part and the liberal part are in conflict, and in the real world, the democratic part, gradually erodes the liberal part. The rise of right-wing populist parties in the West, I think, is a good example of this. And if that is the case, namely, if the liberal part and democratic part are in conflict, then we have to make a choice. Do you like the liberal part better or the democratic part better? And me personally, I like the liberal part better. So I want to save the liberal part from the democratic part. So that's the basic drive, or one of the basic drives for my book. And of course, before we can go into this, one question that was already raised is that Confucianism doesn't sound very liberal from the past. Oftentimes, it's considered kind of very oppressive teaching of philosophy, and so actually I put it at the end of my book, but so that on the question whether Confucianism and liberalism can be compatible, and to argue for that, my inspiration came from the later Rawls. Rawls argue that in a pluralistic society, if liberal democracy has to be grounded in some kind of metaphysical doctrine, be it Kantian or Millian, whatever liberal doctrine, then liberalism cannot become universal, because in a liberal society, people think differently. You can never expect a liberal society to be all Kantians. If that's the case, we have to allow liberal democracy to be read differently, as long as we have an overlapping consensus. So from that insight, I try to argue that, of course, Confucians don't talk about rights, but they do talk about duties. And duties and rights oftentimes are two sides of the same coin. That's one strategy for Confucianism, for Confucians to embrace liberalism. Another strategy, for example, free speech, which I value dearly. I'm a scholar. Free speech is my lifeline, right? And for Confucians, a good government has to be based on, people have to express whether they're happy with their government or not. That means that people have to be allowed to speak. And also, for the meritocrats to make good policies, meritocrats have to be able to discuss freely with each other on policy issues. So, although free speech is not the highest good for Confucians, good governance is the highest good for Confucians. Yet, free speech is an essential element to good governance. Therefore, Confucians can endorse free speech as something necessary, leading to what they consider the most important thing in politics, namely good governance. And another strategy, actually, Joseph Chang first introduced this idea, the idea of fallback mechanism. Ideally, we want virtuous people to do the right things, but just in case they don't, right? Laws and the rules, punishments can be used to prevent them from abusing their power. So I think, although Confucians apparently are not liberals, through this kind of more kind of relaxed mechanism, we can show that Confucianism can be compatible with liberalism, and then the democratic part, right? So we probably the audience all know that Confucians, at least Mencius and Xunzi, believe in equal opportunities, right? Everyone has a chance to become the ideal human being, right? And if everyone has a chance to become the ideal human being, and the government is responsible for actualizing everyone's potential, that means that government should make sure to offer the basic goods to people for them to realize their potentials, right? So for Confucians, equal opportunities are essential. However, although we should have equal opportunities, in reality, people end up differently, right? And that's another, I think, fundamental belief for Mencius and Xunzi. If that is the case, right? If people's political decision-making capacities are different in reality, in actuality, then we should give more power to those who can make better decisions for all the people, right? So that's the basic idea of meritocracy. However, for Mencius in particular, Mencius is quite clear about this. Whether a government is doing a good job or not, that has to be determined by the people themselves, right? Famously, Mencius quoted a Confucian classic that heaven hears through the ears of the people, heaven sees through the eyes of the people, right? People have to decide whether the government is a good government or not. But people cannot decide on what to do with the government, what policies to make, right? So I think that's our argument for the democratic element of the ideal regime. So people's voice has to be expressed somehow, and one person, one vote is one way to do it, right? And then in this ideal regime, we need the democratic part to have people's voice heard. But people cannot make, the majority of the people cannot make good decisions. That's why we need somehow identify those who can make good decisions for the people and give them more political decision-making power. Actually, that idea originally came from Daniel. He's one of his earlier works. So the idea of bicameral structure, right? We have, if we have two houses of legislature, we have one popularly elected house to have a people's voice expressed. We have a meritocratically selected house for political decision making. And in my book, I propose three mechanisms to identify the meritocrats, right? First, the kind of a revised version of Keju exams, the Confucian public servant exams, right? And of course, nowadays, you cannot use exams alone to identify the meritocrats. But we can use exams as qualifications, right? So if you want to become a candidate for senator in the American setting, right? Senators are responsible for making foreign policy decisions, right? So if you want to become a candidate for the Senate, you need to take, for example, the American Foreign Service exam, right? Which I'm told is a very tough exam to take, right? You have to know where Iraq is. You have to know a little bit of Iraq history before you can vote on the war on Iraq, right? And so that's, one mechanism, exam as qualification. And second, so my argument against democracy is really that, why people cannot make good decisions. Because I think two factors. One, every modern state is way too large for common people to appreciate adequately, right? Two, common people are busy with their own lives, so they don't have time, and the political affairs are just too complicated. So no wonder they almost always make wrong decisions, even for their own self-interest, right? So if that is really the obstacle for a full-blown democracy to function well, then I think on the local level, people, on the communal level, people can still make good decisions. It's just on higher level, they couldn't make decisions. So maybe on higher levels, legislature on higher levels, the meritocratic branch should be, candidates for the meritocratic branch, the upper house on higher levels, should be legislators one level lower, right? The legislators are free from their daily chores. They're already involved in politics, so they might be better equipped at making political decisions. So that's the second mechanism. The third mechanism actually is something that troubled Confucians in the past, namely, even if we acknowledge the idea that we need virtuous, rulers, how do you identify virtues? Exam is not. They often criticize that exams are not good indicators, and so I think we need to find proxies, good proxies, to identify virtues. And one of the proxies I propose, for example, if someone, again using the American context, if someone is a governor of a state for 2 terms, right, and he has approval rating of 40%, so his ability has been proven, right, through 2 terms, 2 elections, 2 terms, average approval rating 40%. So then probably he or she is a capable person who can care for the people, right? Then we can get that person to the Senate for 1 term only, 10 years without re-election. So he or she doesn't have to think about to cater for the voters anymore. Rather, his or her capacities are already proven. Just let that person make decisions on his or her own, right? So that's really so my domestic proposal. And then moving on to the international setting, I think internationally the question is similar, namely, not every state makes equally good decisions. If not every state makes equally good decisions, then states should be given different powers. So there should be a hierarchy on the international scale as well. We should give those who are capable of making decisions, namely so-called great powers, states that could have influence through their economic and military strength or some kind of soft power, right? We should give those states more say, and also we want those states to be responsible, right? We want to give powerful and responsible states more political voice, decision-making power on the international scale, right? So that's one way to understand my proposal on the international scale. And in a way, actually, that's what from how I understand, that's how John Rawls proposed in his Law of Peoples. In his Law of Peoples, he basically introduced a hidden hierarchy in his ideal international order. The so-called well-ordered peoples, the liberal peoples, and the people from decent hierarchies are basically the de facto world police, right? And so they try to run international affairs. So I think, in a way, my proposal is a kind of Confucian version of Rawls' proposal in his Law of Peoples. Actually, a similar defense can be made for my proposal on the domestic level. Namely, Rawls has this early Rawls has this famous principle, the difference principle, the idea that economic inequality can be tolerated if the worse off, can benefit from this economic hierarchy, right? Then so my defense for the political meritocracy that then political hierarchy can be tolerated if that hierarchy benefits the worse off the most, right? And then if we push this idea to the international scale, then if great powers can be more responsible, they can be given more political decision power on the international scale. Okay, let me just put my proposal on the international level differently. And so I think another reason I want to make this proposal is that nowadays, we know globalization encounters a lot of problems. And to me, the reason globalization has encountered so many problems is that I think deep down globalization is a self-defeating project, because globalization is led by nation states. And nation states, by definition, are doing whatever it takes for their own self-interest. So, but globalization means going beyond nation states. So when globalization doesn't harm national interests too much, then they can allow globalization to go on. But now, especially, for example, in the case of the US, now China becomes number 2, right? China, through globalization, threatens American dominance. And that's why I think Americans start feeling very unhappy about globalization. They try to reverse globalization. And other right-wing governments have similar drives. So I think, as long as globalization is led by nation states, as long as nation states are doing whatever it takes for their own national interests, there won't be any stable global order, right? And then a solution is to go to the other extreme, right? Let's abolish states also completely the kind of high communist ideal. Sometimes Daniel would like to embrace. But I think it's just too good to be true. We human beings organize ourselves in groups, and states do a lot of things for their peoples. And so I think states are here to stay. So then the only realistic solution is to make states more responsible, and let states take more powers. But as Spider-Man says, with great powers comes great responsibility. So if we have this kind of balance, and then maybe we can solve the chaos of globalization. Maybe just make one more attempt. So basically, what I'm trying to do on the international scale is is the hope that maybe the only salvation of the human race lies in some kind of a benevolent world police. So maybe if EU, China, and US work together to maintain good order, maybe that's the only hope to solve problems such as climate change. But I know in reality, we know what happens between the US and China. So in theory, I think there is a solution. In reality, I'm completely hopeless. So I will just stop here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Bai's wonderful talk. Then we move on to the commentators. So first of all, Professor Jing Li, it's your floor, so please.
Professor Duan, did you call on me?
Yes, because Rana has left. So,
yeah. No, I apologize. I didn't prepare for any comments on Professor Bai's book, because my understanding was I was just going to comment on Professor Bell and Professor Wang's just hierarchy. I apologize. I misunderstood the task. But
do you want to say something?
Yeah, it sounds like a great. I met Tongdong a few years ago, and I didn't get a chance to look at your book carefully, but now I will. It is really, I would say, very huge attempt to write on that subject, because here, just as a regular, sort of ordinary person living in the United States, I am a citizen of the United States. I vote. And a lot of problems that you talk about are daily problems, and we see it. We see how the system actually is not working. It has caused a lot more problems on the ground, really day to day. And I mostly work in the field of education. And you can see, even though there's a very clear, conclusive research on, we know how to help, how to equalize, how to help the most needy population in every way, healthcare, education, and support their development and enabling them to flourish. And I think these ideas came, from Xunzi, of course, Confucius to some extent, as Daniel Bell said, Xunzi, but also mentions, just you gotta give people enough. I mean, I think Joseph Chang talked about that too. Okay, here, people who have means in the United States, right? You're middle class and you have a good education. Your parents have good education. Your parents have some property. Chances are, not chances are, pretty conclusive sociological and psychological and political research, economic research, and clearly documenting the kind of problems that do the people at the bottom have the power to vote? Yes, they do, but not. I'm sorry, I'm a little bit not very kind. Okay, we know in my field of education, nothing seemed to have changed for the people at the bottom. Then we really have to question, and we have to think about what Tongdong and Daniel and Pei are talking about. There's something not right. It sounds very good, okay, in theory, okay, and then people may be made to feel, I'm only talking about, but in reality, nothing really changes, feel that they have the power. But that is an illusion, maybe not intended by the design, by people like John Locke and people like, Thomas Hobbes, or the contractual philosophers and so on. Rawls, let's strip all the human conditions and emotions, relationship. Let's just talk about the veil of ignorance. Okay, let's see if we have the raw sense of justice. But that, I think, speaks to Daniel and Wang's book. It's like, there is this idea, let's pretend it's not there. I have a problem actually with that kind of theory. And it doesn't work in reality, even despite the decades, if not longer, research saying we know what's wrong. We know how to help the most needy people in a democratic society. Maybe Europe has a better example, but then you also hear the Tangping. Lots of people in Sweden just gave up because they get checks every month from the government. And government takes care of it. People lose this incentive. There's a lot of drinking problems, a lot of issues in the Scandinavian countries. Okay, people do everything. For example, oh, your shopping bag is the same as mine, but I'm going to make it a little more distinctive so I can stand out. And there is still this idea. Anyway, Tongdong, I apologize, Professor Duan, I misunderstood. But from what Tongdong and Professor Mitter talked about, I think your book is fabulous. It's just trying to analyze, what might be the issue, what fails, why this is the problem, what might be solutions. I promise you, Tongdong, because we're both Bergreen Fellows, and I will read your book and probably write to you. And that's just my quick comment, Professor Duan. And this is a fabulous, this is wonderful. Yes, thank you so much for writing this courageous. I'm glad that people didn't shoot you down. I'm glad what Professor Mitter said, that this is actually the best defense for liberal democracy, for liberal ideas, okay, just like equality and give people freedom and so on. But yet, in reality, this other piece didn't seem to work together. Thank you very much for that great insight.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Jing Li. And Professor Bai, would you like to respond?
Actually, I mean, although probably you said you didn't prepare. I think it's really a wonderful comment. Yeah, thank you for all the good words you said about my book. But also, I think the comment itself is really wonderful. I think that's kind of what annoys me. We see that people. I mean, in a democratic country, people go to the voting booth and vote every time they pick the wrong leader, and then after 4 years they do it again, hoping that they can change. And so people were critical of so-called authoritarian regimes. They say there is some kind of authoritarian premium, right? They have this false hope of authoritarianism. I think there is a kind of democratic premium as well, right? We think that democracy is really the best or the least worst regime, right? Least bad regime. So although the regime keeps failing, I don't know, people have this illusion of changing things. Although they cannot really change anything, they still put hope on this regime. I think that's, for lack of better term, that's just pathetic. And I think the same with education. I think some of that was mentioned earlier. I think in the American educational system, people believe that you can become whatever you want to be, by your own personal effort. But the reality is that economic status, decides your education. Your education decides your economic status. So people actually, there's a stagnant, the classes become fixed. But in a way, it's even worse than the old aristocracy. Old aristocrats, they knew they were born with silver spoon, right? They knew they had privileges. So they knew they were better than the peasants because they had all these things. But nowadays, actually, the upper class people, they still have the same privileges, but they think that they come to the illusion that they achieve this by their own personal effort, and the poor people, they deserve it. The ill-educated people, they deserve it. I think that's that's really a troublesome thing. So I'm really sympathetic to what you, Professor Li, just said. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Chang, it's your floor. So please.
Thank you, Professor Bai. I also share Professor Jing Li's views about your book. It was also long overdue for someone who's studied for an unfinished PhD in political theory. I found that it was definitely an area that was lacking in political theory in Western philosophy as I knew it at the time. Your comments made me think of a question that I hadn't prepared, but I'm sort of interested in your thoughts now. Which so I actually will have two questions. So the first question is, it seems to me that you have said that you want to tip if liberalism and democracy are on a scale, you want to sort of tip the scales more to the liberal side of the political spectrum. And I think what I worry is that in the real world, we already see that existing models have created a lot of popular and populist pent-up frustration with this idea that of unaccountability, and your proposal is to tip the scales even further to a direction in which popular frustration may grow. This may not work in the ideal world, but I fear that in the real world this is the case. And one of the things that you had mentioned in the book was that you assume that uniquely, and I agree with you here, that people don't always know what their or I think you suggest this, I could be wrong, correct me if I'm wrong, that people don't always know what their best interest is. And so what I'm trying to get at is, I think that one really important element of a political meritocracy is an ability for leaders to convince the public that their policies are in fact good for them. Because unlike in democracies where people can sort of, where we assume that their interests are, that what they pick is of their interest, in political meritocracies, we expect leaders to know what is in the best interest of the people, the masses. And there's also a kind of there's also this kind of perception problem here, that we have to let the masses know that, hey, these decisions are indeed the best for you. And so if there is this kind of perception element, and if you think that this is important, how do you think the media should work in a system of a political meritocracy? Because in America, there's a very democratic culture to information and media, because the assumption is that we have to keep it is that the media serves the people, that we have to keep public officials accountable. But in sort of more hierarchical traditions, and I'm drawing a little bit from Just Hierarchies here. There was a section in Just Hierarchies where they talk about how transparency is not necessarily an important good, or political transparency in elite government is not necessarily an important good, and as important of a good in more hierarchical traditions than in democracies. How it seems to me that in more hierarchical traditions, media will work more like propaganda, that, hey, we have to convince the people that our leaders are doing the right thing for you all. Is that sort of, so I'm just curious sort of how you think about information environments in your political sort of ideal. The other question is totally I guess sort of related, and it gets the topic of the fear of, my fear about popular frustration, a pent-up frustration in the real world. I guess the simple question, the question that, if I had one sort of statement to phrase the question, it's, do you think that the problems of liberal democracies today is too much democracy or something else? Because for me, I don't necessarily think that the term crisis of liberal democracy has become a kind of buzzword for basically the past decade, or if not more. And I don't know necessarily whether I agree that democracy is necessarily the problem here. I mean, it seems to me that there are some convincing that the right-wing populist movements of recent years has certainly been a topic that you've mentioned in the book, and that Professor Daniel and Pei have also mentioned in their book. The rise of Donald Trump is a very distinctly sort of process of electoral democracies, and it certainly shows the weaknesses in some ways of democratic systems, in that they tend to privilege personalities over sort of effective governance. But the crisis of liberal democracy precedes the right-wing populism, and what I believe, in my view, it seems to me that right-wing populism was a reaction to an existing problem, and that existing problem seemed to be a kind of out of touch meritocracy. You mentioned globalization, this view that there was a meritocratic elite who had created an international economic system that benefited some people over others. So it seems to me that liberal democracies, one of the main sort of narratives of recent years is that liberal democracies were problematic in part because of a broken meritocracy. I'm curious sort of what you think about of that, because if that's the case, I wonder whether meritocratic reform in the real world is the right remedy for something of that sort. Let me know if my questions make sense. Those are sort of I'll stop there.
Yeah, I mean, they're all really great questions. And just let me address the second question first. I think, you know, the kind of belief in the power of the people, I think only became popular after World War II. I mean, before World War II, although, you know, in the Western world there were so-called democracies, there were a lot of meritocratic checks and balances. Actually, you know, I mentioned that in my book, that what came closest to my proposal is the American regime at its founding, of course, minus slavery and the exclusion of women from political participation. And because American regime at its founding, the reason they had Senate and presidency is to check the power of the people. The Federalists made that kind of argument, right? And but of course there are grave injustice, slavery. No woman can participate. And then I think when they try to get rid of these things, they get rid of the meritocratic parts. So I would say that, you know, democracies seem to function well, you know, in the past, maybe because there were meritocratic elements still remaining. I mean, even in the 1960s, when I came to the US, I was really shocked when I watched a documentary where a housewife was interviewed in the 1960s, and she said, "How dare these students say bad things about our president?" American housewife, right? She sounded just like a Chinese, right? You know, so this kind of respect for government, for presidency, you know, which was it seems to be widespread even in the 60s. Now, you know, it's gone. You know, so I guess, you know, that's so maybe democracy functioned well in the past because there were meritocratic elements, but those elements are gone. And then, you know, about, you know, people's choices, and I think for my kind of meritocracy, you don't need to convince people that you are making good policies. Just you know, just ask them their you know, raw opinions, right? Of course, if you cannot ask them directly, you ask their representatives, right? Representatives that are voted in by popular votes. So I think, you know, Aristotle really has this, you know, great analogy that, you know, I mean, just using his analogy, you know, slightly differently. So the meritocrats are like chefs, right? They cook things, and people are like customers, right? If they buy what the chefs cook, then, you know, it's good. If they don't, then we should, you know, maybe have some different group of chefs, right? And so in that sense, it doesn't really take a lot of convincing. So in that sense, media should remain free rather than a kind of a propaganda branch of the meritocratic government. Of course, you know, I think, you know, in terms of media, although I'm really deeply for free speech and transparency, for that matter. Actually, speaking of transparency, I wrote a small paper, really not a scholarly paper, where I argue that although Confucians don't believe in the power of the intellectual and moral power of the people, yet they still would reject deceiving the people or brainwashing the people, because I mean, as long as you don't go all the way, like the North Korean way, right, controlling everything, every lie by the government, even a good lie for the people, will be exposed. When the good lie for the people, noble lie for the people is exposed, people will lose faith in the government. Then where do they go? They will go to all sort of sources out there, QAnon. I think that's where these things come from. So I think from Confucian point of view, although people probably cannot handle the truth, still we cannot hold the truth back from the people. So I guess that's a sort of a meritocratic or elitist defense of free speech. But I think an even deeper problem is that we know that free speech is often not free. Media are biased, and now the social media are even worse. How do we deal with that kind of bias? And speaking of your former employer, New York Times, every time I'm reading a report on China in New York Times, it makes me a great patriot of China. It's I mean, the New York Times is not lying; it's just biased. It's not that it's not telling the truth. It is truth, but it's just part of the truth, right? How do we deal with that kind of issue? I think that's something I'm still thinking about. I don't have a good answer to that. Right. So about the first question, so it's kind of related to the first question as well. So I guess I know nowadays both the populists are attacking the so-called deep state, right? And a lot of Western theorists are still saying that the problem is it's not that we have too much democracy. It's not that we don't have enough democracy. We don't have a true democracy, right? So I have totally different view. I think that we already have too much democracy. We should have less democracy and more liberalism. And then how could that happen if people are already, especially in a democratic country, people are already so full of resentment of the elites? I don't know, and I don't think there is a short-term solution. Maybe if those democracies keep failing, if they elect someone like Trump again and again, but Trump fails to deliver again and again, and then some other countries that give more power to the so-called meritocrats become more successful, maybe people can change their minds. And yeah, I guess so. It's going to be a very long process. And I'm not very hopeful that eventually people will make the right choice not by their hands, by voting, but by their feet, by choosing to live in certain countries. But it's going to be an extremely long process if it can ever become reality at all. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for the wonderful discussion. By this point, we're supposed to open the discussion to the public, to the audiences. But according to the procedure, actually, we could have Daniel and Wang Pei respond to Tongdong's book, and Tongdong could respond back to Daniel and Wang Pei's comments or their book, and there could be a kind of a discussion between them three authors, and I think this would be very valuable thing to do, and it's very rare that we have these wonderful authors writing on similar topics together. So maybe Daniel and Wang Pei, and you want to say a few words to Tongdong's book, please?
Well, so Tongdong is a wonderful scholar and a kind of, to use Confucian language, younger brother.
白子
But yeah, 白子. And it hurts me to say that he has surpassed me in many ways. So I strongly recommend reading his book. And I do think the world would be a much better place if countries reformed according to the ideal model that he proposes. And his model is much more systematic than, for example, Kang Youwei. But I think it suffers from a little bit of the same problems, which is that it's up there as a very abstract, beautiful model, but it's unclear what social context it's meant to apply to. Because, for example, the idea that there's too much democracy, not enough liberalism. I mean, clearly, I mean, maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but it doesn't seem to be a problem in China. But in the US, maybe, and other Western countries, it's a problem. So this clearly is a book written for that context. And the idea, for example, that, the poor deserve to be poor. I mean, again, that's a kind of maybe some right-wing view in the US, quite widespread. But I mean, in China, who says that? I mean, that's really, it's a book that's written in a sense for American context, but then it's written from a Confucian perspective, and how many Americans use a kind of Confucian perspective to critically evaluate their own society, other than a few academics who work on Confucianism. So here it seems to be more from a kind of Chinese context. So I just want to, I know we've we've discussed this before, and you're from a physics background and you want to have a kind of a model that's universal and so on. But I do think we need to specify the social context in a bit more detail. Just one tiny little point about what you said about our commitment to communism. We explicitly argue that we do like the communist ideal where advanced machinery would do the socially necessary labor and then humans would be free to realize their creative talents. But we disagree with Marx's point that the state will wither away. In modern society, it's not going to happen. I mean, on issues like how to control, AI that's smarter than us, we do need to have a strong state. Of course, other issues as well, climate change, regulation, nuclear weapons. I never argued, and in our book, we didn't argue that the state will wither away. That's when you criticize communism and you're saying that we defend communism, that's a straw man argument. Anyway, thank you. Do you want to say something? No.
Okay, thank you very much. So, Professor Bai, would you want to something back? I mean, responding to the comment and also responding to Daniel and Wang Pei's book.
Yeah, so just finish the other half Daniel didn't mention. So he accused me of having this kind of being a physicist, right? Believing in universal regimes. In my review of Daniel's earlier books, I said he has too much communitarian genes in his academic work. So he always wants to bring things into particular context, which I tend to ignore as a former physicist. So then I think it's really a difficult challenge, right? If I read the book mostly for the Western audience, but I'm using something the West ignores, right? Confucianism. What's the point of reading this book? I think for me, the book is not only for solving problems of developed democracies. Also, I think it's showing where non-democratic states should improve on their political regimes. I think nowadays, both in democracies and non-democracies, democracy becomes a sacred term. You don't challenge democracy. You can challenge constitutionalism. You can challenge liberalism, right? Liberalism often has a dirty undertone in a lot of non-democratic countries. And constitutionalism, rule of law, all those things are not taken as important. But democracy is. But in my view, those other things are quite important and universal. Democracy is not. I think that's a lesson for everyone, including non-democratic countries, including China. And also, I mean, it doesn't have to be for Western states. You know, I think if Singapore can become a little bit more liberal, but preserving its quasi-meritocratic structure, that I think that would be a city on the hill, right? Literally a city. I mean, it's a city-state, right? A city on the hill for the rest of the world.
Singapore has no mountains, by the way. But
yeah, but yeah, but you know, a beacon on the sea. Then and yeah, so I think it's in that sense it's for everyone, just showing what values are important for an ideal state. So it's now my revenge on Daniel and Pei then, right? Okay, and right, so my my vicious attack on my big brother Daniel and also Pei is that you know, actually I mentioned that in the past. So they try to make hierarchies attractive, and I mean I like the idea of hierarchy. Actually, I was thinking maybe my book title should be just hierarchy, but then they use it first, so I couldn't use it anymore. And so to plagiarize my ideas even before they knew about my ideas. So I think I like the idea of hierarchy, but I defend hierarchy really only on the political realm. And they're more ambitious. They try to say hierarchy is good in many different places. And one, I think, a key defense they make is that hierarchy is not really that kind of fixed hierarchy. We can change roles, right? A son can become a father one day, and a husband and wife can, you know, change their positions in different senses of that term. And but I think that there are at least two kinds of hierarchies. One hierarchy is and should be kind of mobile hierarchy. For example, who should be rulers? As long as you have the capacity, you have the will, you have the commitment, you should be a member of the ruling class, right? But if you don't, you're not. So I think that's kind of mobile hierarchy. And I think in the business world, that kind of hierarchy is also good, right? You know, if people by working hard, they can move up the corporate ladder. I think that's a good kind of hierarchy. But if in both in politics and in business, if hierarchy is fixed, however hard you try, you can never move up. I think that's very bad hierarchy. I think on that point, I totally agree with both Pei and Daniel. But I think some hierarchies are kind of natural hierarchies, right? Father-son relation. You know, father should always be the father, should always play the role of the father. A son should always play the role of son in front of his father, right? Of course, one day he will become the father of someone else, his own son. But that's not really the change of hierarchy. It's just, you know, the hierarchical relation between him and his father never change. Rather, what changes is, you know, he could enter a different hierarchical relation between him and his own son. So I don't think every kind of hierarchy should be mobile. And if every hierarchy is mobile, then we might end up with a very bland place where we only have apparent diversity, but deep down, you know, we are all the same. So in that sense, I wish to preserve some kind of natural hierarchies still, in spite of what Daniel and Pei are arguing in some chapters of their books. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And I will let Daniel and Wang Pei to have the last word in this dispute between brothers and sisters. Briefly, please, and afterwards we open the floor. Okay, please.
For this, we argued a certain. Thank you for Professor Bai for the comments, and we mentioned one special like occasion in our book that one one of the like elder parents, if they have this Alzheimer, they would be like babies, and their adult kids need to take care of them, and it happens a lot nowadays because this life expectations would be longer and longer, and things like this would happen more and more. In the past, in ancient times, it didn't happen that often, I guess, but in modern societies it happens a lot. And that's what we said, if the father was not like a father when the kid was very young, and kid was pushed to be a young adult at like 5 or 6 years old, at very, very young age, they really do not know the feeling being taken care of, and this feeling having someone as a father. So when their father or mother have this kind of disease, there are some other disease other than Alzheimer's. They need to take care of their parents. Like at that moment, they don't know how to follow. If they are like crudely taken care of at their young age, they really don't know how to take care of their parents. Probably they would take care of them when they're not so conscious in a very crude way as well. They treat them back. That's what we really wanted to avoid. And that's how we say shifting hierarchies can be possible among this age-based hierarchy in family.
Yeah, I mean, and thank you. And also between students and teachers, or younger professors and older professors, I mean, you know, Professor Bai, I think arguably has surpassed our book in many ways. So, I mean, this is a clear shifting hierarchy. So thank you.
Okay, that's very nice last word. So I thank you very much. And now we open the floor to the audience. If any of you have any questions, please just speak up. Or Paul, do you have any questions?
No, I think we should take questions from the audience. We can maybe give them a minute or two.
Yeah,
Or
sure.
Professor Duan, if you have questions, not to throw it
Yeah,
back, but I know you also work in this area. So
Professor T-Wald as well there.
Professor T-Wald.
But Professor Duan
Yeah.
first.
Yeah.
We're not the fighters here.
Yeah, we shouldn't.
Okay, Professor T-Wald, do you want to say something?
Please go first, Professor Duan.
No, you go first, please.
Okay.
San Tui San Rang. Do it three times.
That's true. Yeah, I'm sorry. You haven't had a chance yet to ask your question, so why don't you do so?
Me?
Yeah.
You want me to ask questions first?
Yes, you've more than earned the privilege to ask a question, having managed everyone so well. Yeah.
Well, I have a brief question. Listening to the two books presentation, and the three wonderful authors. Why do I get the impression that it's kind of a replay between the so-called New Confucianism and the so-called Political Confucianism, the later largely based in mainland China. Well, the other one is overseas New Confucianism, and they try to find the kind of a way to reconcile liberal democracy and Confucianism, and in a way try to also, like Professor Bai just mentioned, try to find ways to revise the liberal democratic model, to remind them that there's something that's very important to liberal democracy that may sound like a little bit undemocratic. And also by doing this wonderful work, we can also remind countries like China, if we want to democratize, there are something that's variable that we don't want to relinquish. So, for instance, some form of inequality on the basis of meritocracy. So this sounds like a kind of a version of New Confucianism, but Daniel and Wang's book seems to me they want to do something entirely different, like find a sort of alternative model to what people usually call liberal democracy. They didn't say that, of course, specifically in the book, but it seems that they tend to do that in that direction. So what do you say to this kind of comparison? I mean, to the three authors.
Maybe Tongdong, you go first. I think it's a good point, actually.
No, I think it's a question mostly for you.
No, I mean, I do think it maps on to the earlier debates where the Confucian-inspired scholars in, for example, Hong Kong and Taiwan, like Tang Zhongyi and Tang Junyi and Mo Zhongshan, they rejected the kind of alternatives to liberal democracy, and they thought we can have lots of Confucian resources to promote
新外王.
Whereas, and perhaps Professor Bai fits more in that long tradition, whereas I think both of us are a bit more sympathetic to the underlying principles of modern communist China, to be frank, right?
Communitarianism.
Yeah, and communitarianism, yeah. I mean, I do think that is a substantial difference, yeah. But maybe
because we never hold a view of totality, that a hierarchy is something as a holism thing. We argued 5 different kind of social hierarchies, but not the hierarchy for the whole society. Yeah. So it's very context oriented and context based, and basically it will be easier to understand if we focus on East Asia society. Yeah.
And for us, social context is important. I mean, just think of when we address our Chinese professors and friends, we always say 什么什么老师, but in the West you would use their first name. And I mean, it seems so natural to think that way, and the social context matters. Whereas I think Professor Bai would maybe
more ambitious,
yeah. But anyway, let's hear the response from the other side.
Right. So I guess the so-called overseas New Confucians, Mo Zhongshan, Tang Junyi, and what I'm doing, I think I have one thing in common. I think probably both sides believe in some kind of universality of their proposals. So in that sense, I think the overseas New Confucians and I were actually the so-called mainland New Confucians. The political Confucians are on the same page, or some of the political Confucians are on the same page. But I have a great reservation against the overseas New Confucians. I think they on the one hand, they try to preserve too much. They try to preserve some kind of a Confucian moral metaphysics, which is doomed, to be a minority view in a pluralistic society. On the other hand, I think they give up too much. They especially the Mo Zhongshan and his followers, they believe that democracy is the way to go, and they just want to make Confucianism compatible with democracy. I think they give up too much. So I think they're wrong on both sides. I guess I guess that's my view on this matter.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so Professor T1, would you like to ask a question?
Thanks so much. Yeah, I don't want to be the person who asks a very long-winded question just when everyone's thinking that they're off the hook and they can now leave. So I'll just I had a very complicated question for Pei and Daniel. So let me just say, yeah, I'm very familiar with both books. I think they're terrific books. I think social hierarchy and the very idea of just hierarchy as opposed to unjust hierarchy is woefully under theorized. So for that reason alone, I think the book is really makes a tremendous contribution. I still, at the end of the day, am sort of tempted by this view that at least in human hierarchies, the one thing that is always consistently unjust is what Philip Pettit calls domination. And so I've always found very appealing this idea of freedom as non-domination, understood as something like the ability not to be at the whim or arbitrary will of another, and always having some court of appeal or some formal mechanism that you can appeal to if some basic interest of yours is threatened by, say, like your dissertation supervisor or your boss or what have you. Yeah, so that's one that's a short version of a question that I had for Daniel and Pei, is how they see something like non-domination as fitting into their theory of just hierarchy. And then my sort of enduring question for Tongdong, I've noticed ever since I read his book for the first time, and I've now read it a couple times, that really most of the things that he seems to be demanding of his sort of just regime are in fact instantiated in the early constitutional U.S. American Republic, prior to the democratization of the Senate, and back in the day when the Electoral College was really meant to be kind of an elite group that selected the president. So anyway, I've often wanted to press Tongdong on this question of whether his regime isn't in fact just a kind of early American regime. So those are my two questions.
Okay, thank you very much. So who goes first?
I think the younger brother would go first normally in the
we go by age, 序齿, so the respect.
Well, we have two people in our group,
Okay.
one of whom is younger, one of whom is older, so that's ambiguous.
We go with the older one in the group.
Okay.
So I mean, regarding the Pettit view of freedom as non-domination, I mean, yes, I mean we agree with that. So we oppose hierarchies that involve the powerful people oppressing those with less power. But some of the things he says, like the ultimate test of non-domination is if you could look at people in the eye and treat them as equals. But as you know, in East Asian societies, I mean, if you look somebody in the eye, it's sometimes it could be interpreted as rude, right?
As an attack.
As an attack, yeah. So it's sometimes you have to bow to people. I mean, it's viewed as a sign of respect. And so I mean, the ultimate principle that we shouldn't exploit or dominate those with less power, of course, that's a good idea. But the way that the metaphors he uses are just
not very Confucian influenced, social context based.
Yes, yeah.
The phenomenology, I think, is bad. Yeah.
Yeah, sociology is bad. Yeah.
Okay.
Right. So
yeah.
Right. So I think my kind of Confucian proposal is similar to the Federalist proposal. I think the similarity just shows the universality of certain fundamental human insights. So I'm not really too much bothered by that. And also I think but at least I think the kind of Confucianism I'm proposing offers a much more systematic account, right, of the hybrid mixed regime. why we still need to give voice to the people. What's governmental responsibility, right? Offer basic goods, right? Basic living, healthcare, education, all those things to the people, right? And actually, I think someone commented that if in the Declaration of Independence, there's we have if it's added that happiness and health are also guaranteed, that would be a better regime. So I think the Confucian would very much like to add those things, right? So I guess the Confucian economy is more systematic and more comprehensive, and also following the same similar idea, we can also go to the international order. So in that sense, it's theoretically more neat in a way, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I guess that's a beauty of using Confucianism. So you can find similarities here and there from different proposals, but my proposal is just one package based on some fundamental Confucian ideas.
Yes,
I think
fair
if that
enough.
holds, that's good enough for me.
Yeah, it's true. The founders of the American Republic, the so-called founding fathers, didn't prioritize health and what was the other one? Happiness. The pursuit of happiness, yes, but not happiness itself.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. So, any other questions from the audience? Oh, Paul?
Yeah, no, I think it's about time because I didn't want to keep people too long. So yeah, I just want to thank everyone for coming. This was, I think, a really great event, and it's exactly what we're trying to do here at四海为学, just have conversations basically, right? And sometimes the most important thing is to get people from different places together and just talking. And if we have that about some challenging ideas like hierarchies, that's even better. So yeah, I just want to thank everyone again. I also wanted to mention that there's we have about 2 events every month scheduled all the way through to next May, and then we'll be scheduling more events probably in the next couple months for next year, because we started last year and it was pretty successful. And yeah, we have a lot of really great stuff going on. So if anyone's interested, I put a link in the chat, or you can just go to sihaiweixue.org and you can find anything. And if anyone has ideas for different book discussions or roundtables or seminars that they would like to see us host, then we're always happy to work with people. So thank you very much to all the speakers and the participants and everybody who came to this. I know a few people already left, so I think it's.
But Paul, do you have any comments or criticisms or?
No, I don't. Nothing too specific now. I just wait, let me just end the recording. I don't have too much now because I have my godson's birthday, which I'm gonna be late.
Oh.
Yeah, so that's my real reason.